You know what you should read. You know what you should read. You know what you should read.
It's time for What You Should Read, the podcast all about the titles you need. Join 3 book lovers and a guest as they cover all the best new titles to enjoy with your tea.
I have that, but I haven't read it yet.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our special bonus episode of the What You Should Read podcast. Today, we are so excited to be joined by author Anna North. Anna, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we're really excited to talk to you. We all read your book Outlawed, which just came out. And tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, what kind of books you write, and tell us a little bit about Outlawed.
So, I'm a novelist and a journalist. I'm a reporter at Vox, VOX, and this is my third novel. My first novel, Pacifica, was kind of a dystopia. My second novel, The Life and Death of Sophie Stark, was a more straight up realist story about a female film director and her life. And then Outlawed is my third, just came out in January. And one way to think about it is as a revisionist Western. So it is set in 1894, but not our 1894. It's an alternate history. In this world, there was a devastating flu pandemic in 1830. I will say there was an actual flu pandemic in 1830, but it didn't destroy the United States. But in this case, it does. So in the book, basically the US government falls, descendants of former Americans live sort of dotted in independent towns around North America. And because so many people have died from the pandemic, they actually become really obsessed with reproduction. So a sort of obsession with replacing the population that's been lost and also with deriving a sense of hope from childbearing. The obsession is so great that people who are infertile are deeply stigmatized, especially women, quote unquote, barren women can actually be hanged as witches. So the book follows Ada. She's a 17-year-old apprentice midwife who gets married, but after a year of marriage, she isn't pregnant. And so she risks, potential hanging, stigma. She's in a lot of danger. She flees. She ends up meeting the mysterious Hole in the Wall gang, who are based on a real gang of outlaws, the Hole in the Wall gang. And she kind of has to decide if she should join up with them and participate in a dangerous plan they have to create a haven for people like her.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, where the element of the flu pandemic came in, and it's so interesting because I'm guessing the idea for this book came before the pandemic we're currently living in. So was that kind of a surprise to you when last March hit and this all happened?
Yeah, yes, it was a surprise. So I had pretty much finished the book when, things started shutting down here in New York where I live. I've been telling the story a lot, but I was like in copy edits. So, they send you like a big, printed out manuscript with like notes on it. And I would like take it to a coffee shop and, like answer the notes in pen. And I remember in March, like taking it to my local coffee shop and like bleach wiping down everything and like hand sanitizing, and like everyone around me was only talking about COVID. And then I was like, oh, this is gonna be the last time I work in a coffee shop for a really long time. And indeed, like I haven't, that coffee shop is open, which is nice, but I definitely haven't like sat and worked in it. And I don't think you're allowed to.
Yeah, you must miss that. I mean, I think a lot of writers are dealing with the disruption to their process, right? Because of this.
Yeah, I mean, it's a small thing, but it is really too bad, because I definitely used to like try to enforce a sort of physical separation between A, my journalism work, B, just like my life here with my family, and C, fiction writing. And so I would always try to do fiction outside the house, especially, I have a toddler, so I find it like much easier to focus like somewhere else. But right now, that is not safe. So everything happens in the house, which, is a privilege of its own, but I'm definitely looking forward to having that, being able to create that physical separation again. Definitely creating that sort of like separate space.
Yeah, especially I think when you have kids, I think a lot of people are going through that as well. So your book is a feminist retelling, or not retelling, but like you said, it's sort of inspired by the story of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And I was just curious, I'm actually a really big fan of Westerns. Kind of as of recently, I took an improv class that was improvised Western. So we learned how to improvise a Western. And so I watched some Westerns to kind of learn more about the genre. And I'm like, oh, Tombstone's one of my favorite movies now. So are you a big fan of the genre? What made you decide to set this story in this world, in this setting?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't a super huge fan of the genre before. It's nice to hear you say that you're into it, because I feel like a lot of and these are nice comments, but a lot of the comments I get are like, oh, I never thought I would read a Western before, but like here I am, which is nice, but it's also it is a really interesting genre. It's not one that I had read a ton before, but so basically I had the idea at first, and I wanted to write about like a group of people who sort of live separately from society. And I also was interested in kind of critiquing some of our cultural ideas about reproduction. Very early drafts, I was actually inspired by the Shakers, who were like a separatist religious sect in the Northeast. But I was having a lot of trouble. Like it wasn't coming together. I was writing about these people like living, and then I started thinking about, well, who else lives apart, right? Like what are groups of people that like live together, but apart from society? And I thought of outlaw gangs. And I wasn't reading Westerns at the time, but I was reading some things that are sort of like weird Westerns or Western adjacent. In particular, I was reading a lot of Crazy Cat, which is it's a newspaper comic strip from the 19-teens and the 1920s. Crazy Cat is about a cat that's in love with a mouse, and the mouse hates the cat, and they have adventures throwing things at each other mostly. And it's like for children, but it's also not. And one thing about it is that it's very sort of ahead of its time in the way that it portrays gender fluidity. The cat uses different pronouns at different times, and this was something that the author really cared about and stood by. And it's also kind of a Western. It's set in a sort of like weird version of Arizona. There's like a sheriff in it, in almost like the like Jellystone Park or something. It's like that kind of Western. But I was thinking about this a lot, and I was thinking about this cat, who uses different pronouns, and thinking about the ways that in the past people have understood gender and sexuality and gender fluidity. And that sort of started to come together and like form this idea of like, how could I revise the tropes of the Western and make them into something a little bit different?
Oh, that's so interesting. And I think what you said about how a lot of readers have commented like, oh, I never thought I would read a Western. I do think typically the stories in Westerns have been more male focused and male centered. And so it is even, I think, more cool and interesting that you've set this story as a Western. And I love the inspiration and how it came about. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, I do think certainly when I was writing this, I thought of like the Western as a super male dominated genre. And I really like consciously wanted to turn that on its head. At the same time, since I finished the book, I feel like I've been like, for the whole time I was writing it, I like wouldn't let myself read any Westerns. Like Crazy Cat at the limit. I was like, I don't want to like prejudice myself, like get stuff in my head too much. But after it was done, I started reading. There's a lot of like really interesting sort of revisionist Westerns. How Much of These Hills is Gold is probably like the best example, which is a really wonderful book about a family in the gold rush, and turns a lot of these tropes on their heads, and focuses on a young woman and her sibling. Anyway, you don't have to take it from me. Barack Obama also recommends this book. But there's a few others recently that I read that are kind of like, I think there's like a growing desire to kind of play with some of these tropes that are very sort of like, the Western is supposed to be this like American myth, right? And it's been this very exclusionary American myth that's like mostly about white guys. And I think there's been like a larger and larger appetite by a variety of writers to kind of like play with that and be like, wait, like let's expand this myth. Like it doesn't have to only be for, a few white men shooting at each other.
Mm-hmm, for sure.
So actually, Roger Ebert, who I loved, said that if you're the kind of person who will say, I don't like this genre, like blanket statement, I don't like it. You are not sufficiently evolved as a moviegoer, which I thought was just, I mean, it's a bitchy thing to say, but it's also kind of true. And I've been trying to do that as a reader too. So hopefully maybe the other I don't like Western readers are, maybe seeking out more. One of the things I loved best about Outlawed is that it feels both very foreign and very, very familiar. Um, Sorry, I'm reading this off of my phone because my handwriting is god awful.
Same
Um,
with mine.
okay, so it is a mixture of historical and alternate fiction, but a lot of your nonfiction work also deals with the same themes like bodily autonomy and reproductive rights and the policing of women's bodies, which are obviously still problems today. Why did you decide to deal with it in this way?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think when I was starting to write this book, I didn't consciously think, I'm going to deal with the same themes that I deal with in my journalism, but certainly these are themes, that have interested me for a long time and troubled me for a long time. So it's not surprising that I would maybe try to go at them from different angles a little bit. I will also say that when I was starting to write this book was also when, I was relatively recently married. My husband and I were thinking about whether we should have children. So I think these themes have become personal in a certain way too. I have a lot of privilege in American society. I, had access to birth control, for example, and, was able to make some of these choices as choices in ways that not everyone is able to. But I do think there was this feeling, I was entering a time in my life when it's like, I'm going to make this decision about whether or not I'm going to be a mother. And I think I just was thinking a lot about the ways in which, for pretty much anyone assigned female at birth and some people who aren't, the question of whether you're a mother is placed on you in this really heavy way by American society. And you have to answer that question, and it determines the way people value and the way people see you. And that also varies by race and by class. Who is a fit mother? Who is a mother who is able to have as many children as she wants, and who is a mother who's going to be judged for having children, or who is a mother who's going to be judged for not having children. I think these things, that I'd sort of been covering as a journalist for a long time became personal to me in a certain way. And that is sort of when I started wanting to address them in some way in my fiction.
I think a lot of times our worth as women externally is decided in our relationships to people, like, oh, I'm this person's wife, that person's mom, whatever. And I just love in the book that's not really true. Like, everybody's worth is more like, this is what I do, this is the value I bring.
Yeah.
I don't have a question, I'm sorry.
No, I like that. I mean, I think I definitely was inspired, when I was thinking about the Hole in the Wall gang, which I think is a really good example of what you're talking about, where they're very much, and Ada talks about this. She feels inspired by the fact that they're really good at what they do. And, they're sort of at the height of their powers in terms of their different crafts and their skills. And when I was writing about them, I was inspired by the real life Hole in the Wall gang. But I've talked about this a little bit in other venues, but I was also really inspired by heist movies. And so in the heist movie, it's like you'll always meet the different members of the gang, and each of them has their particular skill, and you'll see them like using it really well. Like in the opening montage, one person's like hacking into a computer system, one person's like creeping through the air ducts, one person is like doing like sophisticated pickpocketing. So I mean, obviously these are criminal skills, but I wanted to kind of convey that with the Hole in the Wall gang, this sense that like everyone is an expert at something, and bringing together this band of experts to in the case of this book, hopefully do something kind of inspiring. So yeah, I mean, I really like that you picked up on that.
What was the first kernel of an idea for this? Not necessarily like where you got the idea, but what was it? Just maybe picturing the Hole in the Wall gang as part of this story, not in history, or like was there maybe an image or?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely, so I got this idea when I was actually visiting a Shaker dwelling in New Hampshire. So there's, various places in the Northeast and elsewhere. The Shakers built these like really beautiful buildings. Like they were really known for their architecture and for their craftsmanship. And they were also known for, like I said, for separatism, and they were celibate. They didn't have children, and they would sort of live communally. So almost like a big dorm. Anyway, I just thought it was so interesting, this building and this different way of living. And so that was kind of the germ in some ways, was being in this building and thinking about like a group of people. They've chosen to live really differently than the way that other people in their society live. And they also live like together communally, like a team. I mean, obviously the Shakers are very different from Outlaws or from the Outlaws in this book, but that was really kind of the tiniest little germ. And then from there, it probably took at least a full year of writing before I felt like I really hit my stride with it.
Wow. And now it's going to be a movie, right? It's been optioned. Kelly, did you?
A TV show.
Right. Yeah.
Which I'm actually super excited for, because I think a lot of times, when a book is optioned for something else, like it may or may not be good, but Amy Adams seems to do good work in A24. Like, I think it's probably one of the best possible outcomes. But also, I know you were a Reese Witherspoon book club pick. What has this been like?
Yeah, so I'm excited about all these things. Yeah, I'm really excited to work on it with A24 and Amy Adams, and I'm just so like grateful and excited to see what happens next. Yeah, and the Reese's book club pick was such a such an unexpected joy and wonderful thing to happen. I was definitely like totally taken by surprise when my agent let me know that would be happening, and then when Reese Witherspoon actually announced it on her Instagram and she's wearing like a costume, like an Outlawed costume, was just this, extreme fangirl moment. I mean, I have told other people this, but my friends were all texting me saying like Reese Witherspoon is wearing a costume from your book. So cool and surreal. And also just like such a surreal thing. I mean, as I'm sure, you talk to tons of authors, so you've heard this a lot, that like, it's been such a strange time to have a book come out. 2020, 2021, we can't have readings in bookstores. We can't go to festivals. Like there's not the sense of like meeting readers in person the way that there sometimes would be. So it was such like a wonderful gift to, hear from someone, whose films I love, and someone that just is such a wonderful force for books. That was really exciting. And then the sort of bonus is that Reese's Book Club is such a big Instagram community that a lot of folks really have found the book on Bookstagram. And that's been like this really nice way of connecting with people when it's really hard to connect with people. People like, I've been just really loving people take photos of the book with their cat, or in one case their lizard, and it's just this like really nice way of connecting with readers when it's like otherwise really hard to do that, and just connecting with people. Like, it's an isolating time for everyone, so I've just like met strangers on Instagram, and that's really nice.
Nice. I feel like I just wanted to mention really quick the portrayal of one of the characters goes through some pretty severe, a pretty severe depressive episode, almost like bipolar. And I just, I felt like that was, the portrayal of that was very, like the way it was portrayed was very engaging. And like, I definitely felt that empathy for that character. And so I don't really have a question, but more just like I guess, yeah, like what are your thoughts on including that kind of a thing in your book?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, when I thought about that character storyline, I definitely felt that, what they experienced with I mean, I feel like we have to name the character because the character doesn't use So this is the kid. I don't think it's too much of a spoiler. I think that what the kid experienced with mental health was just a really crucial part of the way that I thought of that character, and like came to me really early in the process of creating that character. And definitely that was a difficult part of the book to write, because I wanted to make sure that I was doing a good job portraying what the kid is dealing with respect to mental health, and yet at the same time having it be true to the time. So it's not a time when someone could be diagnosed with, for example, bipolar, or even really with depression. They wouldn't have those diagnoses in that world, and they wouldn't necessarily have the same kind of treatments that we have. So I wanted to try to show that the kid is still loved and cared for by the kids community and by Ada, even though there's not like a way, for example, for the kid to get like medication, or for the kid to get the kind of therapy that we would think about today. I still really wanted to show like a way of supporting and offering care for that person in a communal setting. And so that was important to me, and I hope that came across.
Yeah, it definitely showed the way that the characters all care for each other, for sure.
I love the kid.
I know.
It's definitely like one of the most fun and also one of the hardest characters to write in the book, because I want to make someone that's heroic, but also someone that the kid's ideas like don't always work out in the best way. So it was that was complex for me. That's the word I was thinking of. The kid is like very complex.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you might be working on now, whether it be fiction, nonfiction, journalism, what kinds of projects you have going on? Sure. I mean, it's been a really interesting time to think about fiction, because we're still in this pandemic. And, so for example, right before things shut down in New York, I sort of had an idea for a new project, and some of my books have been set, in our reality, and some of our books have been set in sort of alternate worlds like Outlawed. And I had this idea for a project that would be set in real reality. Excuse me. And then the pandemic hit, and so then it became, well, is it going to be set in 2020? Is everyone going to be wearing masks and social distancing? Is it going to be set in some like mythical time after the pandemic? Is it going to be set right before? And I've talked to a lot of fiction writers who are also kind of like dealing with these questions, and people who have like moved the settings of their books. So I think we're in this really interesting time where fiction writers and like all artists are trying to figure out like, how do we respond to this moment, especially since it's still going on and we haven't had time to process. So I've just recently started getting back to something, and I'm not sure what I'm going to do about the time setting yet, but it has been fun to work on. It's been fun. For most of 2020, just to be honest, I didn't have time to do fiction. We've been lucky that we have been able to send our kid back to daycare to some degree, but that's always been a bit uncertain due to the pandemic. And so like many parents during the pandemic, like time has not been a thing that I have a lot of. But I've recently been having more brain space and more excitement about getting back to fiction. So hoping to do more of it in 2021, but we'll see. Nice.
Yeah. I think a lot of writers, like you said, are dealing with the same thing. We talked to Bridget Kemmerer a few weeks ago, and she's basically was like, my husband and I sat down and figured out the only way we could do this was I get up at 4 a.m. and write for a few hours, and then he, goes to work, and then we get the kids doing their schoolwork, and it's just,
It's so hard. And it's not just parents too. Like, I feel like I've talked to a lot of people who don't have children, who are still just, they may have other responsibilities or just feeling burned out. It's a really hard time to do stuff. It's a hard time to be excited about your work when you often don't have a lot beyond your work. It's so hard to connect with people. It's hard to like do the things you'd ordinarily enjoy. So for everyone, it's been like a tough year to get stuff done, among other things.
Definitely. Yeah, for sure. Do you, or I should say, what are you reading recently? Anything good?
I'm right now. I'm reading "God Spare the Girls" by Kelsey McKinney, which comes out later this year, and I'm excited about it. It's very it's not that much like anything I've read before in terms of it's about a sort of a family that's like mega church royalty, which isn't a milieu that I've out before, and sort of a family drama that takes place within that landscape, and so I'm really enjoying that. And let's see, there's my TBR is super tall and long right now. I really want to Transition Baby. I really want to read The Prophets. So a book called Art is Everything that I really want to read by Ixta Maya Murray. It's been a time of like me buying a lot of books because I feel like when you have a book come out, like you find out about all the books that are coming out around the same time and you get excited. And then like maybe hopefully over the next few months, it'll be a time when I actually have time / make time to read them.
Yeah. Well, that book you're reading that you were talking about sounds really good. It's funny. I never would have thought to have a book in that kind of setting with that kind of population. But now that you have said it, it's like, oh, that makes sense. That's such like an interesting
subculture.
Yeah, for sure. So we usually like to ask our guests to recommend a book because our podcast is called What You Should Read. So we want you to tell us what we should read.
Okay, great question. I feel like I already recommended How Much of These Hills is Gold. So I will reiterate that, but I'll add another, like a bonus, which is another one of the revisionist Westerns that I started reading when I was letting myself read Westerns again. It's called In the Distance by Hernan Diaz. It came out, I believe, in 2017 and was nominated for some awards and did really well. But it's one of the strangest books I've ever read. It's very hard to categorize. He did kind of want to write a Western. He's talked about in interviews, but it's so hard to even describe. It's about a young boy who comes from Sweden to the United States to find his brother, and then he gets wrapped up in adventures, but at a certain point he becomes like a celebrated villain for most of American society. He becomes a giant. He grows to extreme height. He does some crime, and so then everyone's afraid of him. So he has to contend with like basically being an unwilling celebrity in 19th century America. Then he digs an underground burrow and he lives there for a while. There's really no description that can do justice to it, but it's very beautiful. It's very strange. Nothing like I've ever read before. And I think for readers that are looking for something really different or looking for something that explores the American West in a truly new and weird way, definitely check it out. It's also an adventure story, like a fun in a very weird story.
Nice.
Sounds awesome. Well, thank you so much, Anna, for joining us. We really appreciate it. And everyone go check out Outlawed, which is out now. You will love it.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You know what you should read? You know what you should read? You know what you should read?
It's time for What You Should Read, the podcast all about the titles you need. Join 3 book lovers and a guest as they cover all the best new titles to enjoy with your